The neon lights of Shanghai blinked lazily in the drizzle, casting an almost otherworldly glow on the streets below. Zhang Wei, a man in his mid-30s with a perpetually tired look, navigated the crowded sidewalk as if he were a ghost. The city was a blur of motion around him, the rush of cars, the hum of conversations, and the constant rhythm of people weaving through the traffic like a living organism. But none of it really touched him. It was just another day in his mundane life. Zhang Wei was just another office drone working for an unremarkable tech company doing unremarkable things, with unremarkable people. He spent most of his workday in meetings that went on forever, drinking lukewarm coffee from a machine that had likely been invented in the 80s, and fending off endless emails that were as interesting as watching paint dry. But lately, something strange had started happening, and it had begun with a crack in the AIR. It wasn't the sort of crack you'd hear in a chair when you sat down too quickly, or the sound a cup makes when it's dropped on a hard floor. No, this was something different. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible noise, a crackling, like the faintest shimmer of static before it burst into full sound. He first noticed it 2 weeks ago, just outside his office building. He'd been walking home, lost in thought about whether he should bring up the topic of a raise with his boss or just pretend to be happy with his lot in life, when he noticed the air before him ripple like a sheet of cellophane caught in a breeze. At first, Zhang Wei thought he was imagining things. It had been a long day, after all. The fluorescent lights at work always made him feel disoriented. But as he stepped closer, the crack in the air expanded, a thin, shimmering line that stretched a few feet wide. His heart raced. He reached out to touch it, and the moment his fingers brushed the surface, the world around him collapsed literally. In an instant, the city around him melted away. The streets, the cars, the bustling crowds, they all vanished, replaced by something strange and surreal. Instead of the familiar Shanghai skyline, he found himself standing in a version of the city that looked 20 years older, maybe more. Old-fashioned cars rumbled past him, the neon lights were harsh and dated, and people wore clothes from a bygone era, with mullets and shoulder pads still in style. The scent of street food filled the air, but something about it felt wrong. It was like walking through a memory, something distant and not quite real. Zhang Wei blinked. Then, the crack in the air snapped shut with a jolt, and he was standing back on the familiar sidewalk, drenched in rain, his heart pounding in his chest. The world was exactly as it had been before, yet nothing felt the same. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something beyond the ordinary, beyond time itself. "Are you all right, young man?" a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up, startled. An old woman was staring at him, clutching a plastic umbrella and eyeing him like he had just sprouted another head. She wasn't far from the same convenience store he usually visited every day. Yeah," Zhang Wei stammered, his mind still reeling from the strange experience. I thought I saw something strange." The woman, unfazed, clicked her tongue. "You kids and your phones, always lost in that digital world." She shook her head and shuffled away, leaving him standing in the middle of the street, drenched in confusion and rainwater. Zhang Wei glanced around nervously, but nothing was out of the ordinary. The city looked the same except for one small detail: a faint, glowing line appeared in the air in front of him. It wasn't a crack this time, just a simple sliver of light, like a wound in reality itself. He felt drawn to it, compelled by some invisible force. Against his better judgment, he took a step forward, reaching out. Before he could touch it, everything shifted again. The air around him hummed, and suddenly he was not in the bustling streets of Shanghai anymore. Instead, he stood on a clean, futuristic street with towering skyscrapers that shimmered with holographic ads and clean glass surfaces. A strange, almost sterile silence surrounded him. Everything was too perfect, too calculated. The people walking past him were dressed in sleek, high-tech clothing, their faces blank and emotionless as if they were all trapped in a digital dream. His stomach dropped. It was like he had fallen into a version of the future that was just out of reach, too polished, too cold. He turned to look at the skyline, the massive glass buildings looming over him. One of them seemed to ripple, like it was made of lights rather than solid materials. Before he could understand what was happening, the rift snapped shut once again, and he was back in the rainy street, standing still, but his heartbeat was racing. What the hell was that? Zhang Wei whispered under his breath. He stumbled backwards, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it some kind of dream? A glitch in his mind? Or was it something much stranger? The next few days were a blur of confusion. Zhang Wei kept seeing those rifts. They appeared at odd moments, sometimes when he was walking to work, sometimes during lunch breaks. Always in places he hadn't expected. And they were always different. Past. Future. Sometimes both. He saw flashes of moments, long-forgotten memories, faces that were familiar yet not quite right, and he couldn't tell if it was a result of his own mind playing tricks or if he was really seeing something impossible. That was when the woman appeared. She stepped out from a side alley one evening, appearing so suddenly that Zhang Wei barely had time to react. She was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and had an air of authority about her, like someone who didn't belong in this world but was still capable of controlling it. "Zhang Wei," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "We need to talk." His mouth went dry. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" "My name is Mingyu," she said simply. "I'm with an organization called the Chrono Order. And I think you've discovered something dangerous." Zhang Wei felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean?" Mingyu didn't answer right away. She just stared at him for a long moment, her eyes sharp, like she could see straight through him. "You've been seeing the rifts, haven't you? The cracks in time. I'm here to explain them to you." Zhang Wei's head spun. "Rifts in time? What are you talking about?" "They're not just glitches in your mind. They're cracks in the fabric of reality itself," Mingyu explained. "They connect the past, present, and future in ways that shouldn't be possible. And you, Zhang Wei, have a unique ability to see them." He blinked. "What do you want from me?" Mingyu stepped closer. "We need your help to fix the timeline. To repair the damage that's been done." "Why me?" Zhang Wei asked, incredulous. "I'm just some office worker." "Because you can see what others can't," she said, her voice low but serious. "You've been chosen." Zhang Wei's mind raced, but before he could say anything else, she handed him a small device, a sleek, metallic tool with glowing edges. "You'll need this," she said. "It can help you seal the rifts. But understand this, Zhang Wei, every time you repair a rift, you'll lose a piece of yourself. A piece of your memory. It's the price of fixing time." He stared at the device in his hand, feeling both confused and oddly exhilarated. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't asked to see the rifts, to be thrust into some secret war to repair the very fabric of time, but somehow, in the pit of his stomach, he knew he didn't have a choice. The device felt cold in Zhang Wei's hand, the smooth surface of it almost unsettling. He turned it over, examining it under the dim light of the alley, but there was nothing about it that made sense. He couldn't tell if it was just a gadget, a piece of advanced tech, or something more, something that had no business being in his world. But Mingyu's serious expression made it clear that this was no joke. "How does it work?" Zhang Wei asked, feeling a sudden weight in his chest. The idea of fixing time sounded absurd. Impossible, even. But something inside him, maybe it was that feeling from before, when the rifts had appeared, told him he didn't have much of a choice. Mingyu's gaze softened slightly. "You just hold it close to a rift, and it will activate. It will help you stabilize the rift, stop it from expanding, and restore the timeline. But be warned, once you do this, the memory will begin to fade. You won't even notice it at first. But it will happen." Zhang Wei swallowed hard. "You're saying if I use this, I'll forget things? People? Parts of my life?" "Exactly," she said. It's the price of fixing time. We all pay it. Zhang Wei wanted to ask how she knew so much, how the Chrono Order had come to know about him, but he couldn't find the words. His thoughts were racing. He had always been the kind of guy who played by the rules. He kept his head down, avoided trouble, didn't rock the boat. But this? This was too much. It was like a riptide dragging him under, and he wasn't sure he could escape. Why me? He said again, the question lingering in the air. Why did I start seeing these things? The rifts? Mingyu's eyes flickered with something regret, maybe, or was it pity? It's not just that you're special. It's that you were exposed to something, a shift in the timeline, an event that triggered your ability to perceive the rifts. You've been affected by something from the past. Something that shouldn't have happened. The words hit him like a slap to the face. Something from the past? He couldn't remember anything like that. He had lived a normal life, as normal as any office worker could. There had been no traumatic event, no strange accidents, nothing out of the ordinary that he could recall. But if what she was saying was true, then it meant that his past, his very existence, was a lie. You're saying I'm a part of this? Some kind of experiment? His voice cracked, the thought too much to grasp. Mingyu nodded slowly. I don't know the details. But I do know this, your ability to see these rifts wasn't accidental. And it's not something we can ignore. Zhang Wei looked at the device again, feeling the strange weight of it in his hand. The thought of losing his memories, losing pieces of himself, gnawed at him. But if these rifts were really tearing apart time, if they were threatening the world, then maybe he had no choice. He had to act, didn't he? How do we start? He asked, his voice steady, even though his insides were a mess. Mingyu gave a slight smile, a hint of approval in her eyes. Good. There's a rift I need you to close tonight. It's in the old district, near the warehouse where they used to store the old movie reels. The mention of that place didn't register at first, but then the name clicked. The old district, an area near the city's outskirts. It was known for its abandoned buildings and rundown streets, a relic of a time when Shanghai was still growing into the megacity it was today. It was strange that a rift would appear there, of all places. The area wasn't exactly a hotspot for anything important. But then again, time itself wasn't interested in making sense. All right, Zhang Wei said, stuffing the device into his jacket pocket. Let's go. They moved through the rain-soaked streets in silence, the only sound the soft patter of raindrops and the occasional hum of neon signs overhead. As they neared the old district, the air seemed to change, thickening with a strange energy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Zhang Wei's palms were sweating, his heart racing in a way he couldn't explain. He had never been someone who believed in the supernatural, who entertained crazy conspiracy theories. But all of that seemed trivial now. The rifts weren't theories. They were real. And they had to be fixed. Mingyu led him down a narrow alley, one lined with cracked concrete walls and rusting fire escapes. At the end of the alley was a small door, barely noticeable, but there was something about it, something off. The air around it shimmered in the way things did just before the rift appeared. This is it, Mingyu said, stopping in front of the door. This is where the rift should be. Zhang Wei nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the device in his pocket. He felt it humming slightly, as if it knew its purpose, as if it was alive in some way. The crackling in the air was palpable now, and as he stepped closer, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He took a deep breath and pressed the device against the doorframe. The rift exploded into being, a jagged tear in the fabric of reality itself. Time seemed to fold in on itself. He could see flashes of past and future intermingling, a child running down a street, a woman holding a baby in a park, a scene of chaos and destruction. All of it was fragmented, blurry, as though the past and future were colliding and bleeding together in a mess of impossible images. Focus, Mingyu said sharply. You have to seal it before it gets worse. Zhang Wei could barely hear her over the overwhelming noise in his mind, the disorienting rush of images, sounds, and sensations. But he knew what he had to do. He closed his eyes, concentrated, and pressed the device against the rift. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a strange warmth spread from the device, pushing against the rift, forcing it to close. The tear in reality shrank, pulling the images back into place. It was like stitching together a wound in the universe, and with every inch of the rift that sealed, Zhang Wei could feel something inside of him slipping away. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was more like a dull ache, a sense of loss. He felt memories drift away, pieces of his life dissolving like smoke. Faces blurred, names vanished from his mind, like they had never been there to begin with. He tried to hold on to them, to fight against it, but the memories were already slipping through his fingers. When the rift finally closed with a soft snap, Zhang Wei staggered back, feeling lightheaded and disoriented. His chest felt tight, like there was a part of him missing. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Mingyu nodded, her face impassive. "For now. But you've lost something. A part of yourself." Zhang Wei didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. He felt incomplete, like a chapter of his life had been erased. But he had done it. He had sealed the rift. He had fixed time, at least, for now. "Come on," Mingyu said. "We need to move. There's more work to be done." Zhang Wei followed her through the alley, the weight of what he had just done settling in his mind. He didn't know how long he could keep this up. The cost was too high, too painful. But he also knew something else now, something that had become clear with every rift he sealed, every memory that faded from his mind. Time wasn't just something that flowed in one direction. It could be broken, manipulated, shattered. And if he didn't fix it, it would unravel completely. But what would happen when there was nothing left of him to lose? Zhang Wei's legs felt unsteady as he followed Mingyu through the narrow, dimly lit alley. He couldn't shake the cold feeling in his chest, the hollow sense that something important had been taken from him, like a small, delicate part of his soul was slowly being chipped away. He tried to focus on the task at hand, the rift, the closing of it, but the feeling of loss gnawed at him. It was like a dull throb in the back of his mind, an echo of something he should have remembered but couldn't. His memories had become ghosts, vanishing before he had a chance to hold on to them. Mingyu didn't seem to notice his discomfort. She led him through the maze of alleys, her footsteps quick and purposeful. They passed through another door, this one set into the side of a crumbling building, and entered a small, dimly lit room filled with old equipment and scattered papers. It had the smell of dust and something older, like it hadn't been used in years. The door shut behind them with a soft click, sealing them off from the world outside. "Where are we?" Zhang Wei asked, his voice sounding strange in the stillness of the room. He wasn't sure why, but the small space, the low light, felt wrong, like it was too confined, too isolated. He couldn't tell if it was the sensation of the rift still lingering in his head or something else entirely. Mingyu didn't look back at him as she moved toward a table cluttered with strange-looking devices, maps, and old books. "This is a safe house for the Chrono Order," she said. "A place where we can regroup and plan our next moves." He looked around, his eyes tracing the cluttered shelves and the strange, technological instruments on the table. There were holographic maps flickering in and out of existence, each showing different points on a map of the city, some marked with symbols Zhang Wei didn't recognize. In the corner of the room, a small metal door led to what looked like a storage closet, its contents hidden behind a curtain of shadows. The entire place felt like a forgotten corner of the world, like time itself had overlooked it. Mingyu walked over to the table, picking up a small device that looked like a cross between a compass and a pocket watch. She held it in her hands, staring down at it as if it were both a puzzle and a warning. "There are other rifts," she said, almost as though she were speaking to herself. "And they're getting worse." "Getting worse?" Zhang Wei repeated, his mind still spinning from the events of the night. "How?" "The one we sealed, it looked like it was going to tear apart everything." The whole city. Was that just one of many? Mingyu nodded. Yes. And that's why we need you. She set the device down on the table with a small clink, turning to face him. You're the only one who can see the rifts, the only one who can help us stop them. But every time you do, you lose something. And that's something we can't afford to ignore. We need to figure out why you're different. Why you were chosen for this. Zhang Wei's head was spinning, but something in Mingyu's words stopped him cold. The sense of loss, of memory slipping away, it had become unbearable, but hearing her speak of it as if it were part of the plan made something click in his mind. He wasn't just losing bits of his past, he was being erased, bit by bit. Was this the price he had to pay for fixing time? Or was there something more sinister at play here? How do I stop it? He asked, his voice quieter now, more uncertain than before. Mingyu's gaze softened, but it was still sharp. We don't know yet. But we're trying to find out. That's why we need you, Zhang Wei. We can't fix the rifts without your ability. But every time you fix one, your memories slip away. There's a limit to how much you can lose before it becomes permanent. She walked over to him, standing close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her, even in the cool air of the room. I know it's hard, she said, her voice low. But we don't have time to waste. The rifts are getting worse, and the damage they cause is irreversible. If we don't stop them soon, the whole fabric of reality could collapse. The weight of her words settled on him like a stone in his stomach. The pressure in his chest grew, and he could feel the loss again, the missing memories, the fading pieces of his past. He wanted to scream, to tell her that he couldn't keep doing this, that he couldn't keep losing himself. But the urgency in her eyes, the sense that the world was on the brink of some unimaginable disaster, stopped him. He knew that if he didn't keep going, the rifts would tear the world apart. And he wasn't sure if he could live with that. All right, he said, his voice hoarse. What's the next step? Mingyu nodded, her expression firm. There's another rift, further out in the city. It's in an old underground parking garage, an abandoned one. The rift is bigger this time, and it's pulling at the fabric of the future. It's causing people to glimpse things that haven't happened yet. That sounds dangerous, Zhang Wei said, shivers running down his spine. What happens if it isn't sealed? If it's left open, Mingyu replied, the future will start to collapse into the present. People will start acting on things that haven't happened yet, and the line between past, present, and future will blur completely. People will stop knowing what's real, what's supposed to happen. Time itself will begin to fracture. The thought of people acting on things that hadn't yet happened, of the future breaking into the present, sent a cold wave of dread through Zhang Wei. He didn't want to imagine a world like that, a world where everything was chaotic, where there were no boundaries, no rules. He swallowed hard, trying to keep the panic from bubbling up. There was no time to waste. Let's go, he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Mingyu didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and moved to the door, pausing only to glance back at him. It's not going to be easy. But you're stronger than you think. Zhang Wei nodded, though he didn't feel strong. He felt like he was falling apart with each step he took. He followed her out of the safe house, into the night, and through the winding streets toward the underground garage. The city felt different now, more oppressive. The hum of the neon lights, the constant rush of people moving in every direction, it all seemed to press in on him, like the world itself was holding its breath. The rift was out there, somewhere, just waiting to tear everything apart. And he was the one who had to stop it. When they arrived at the parking garage, the feeling in the air was unmistakable. It was heavy, thick with the tension of something wrong. The building loomed in front of them like a forgotten monument to a past that no longer existed. The entrance was cracked open, the steel doors warped, as if something powerful had pushed against them from the inside. Mingyu motioned for Zhang Wei to stay close as they moved into the garage, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The rift was close now, and Zhang Wei could feel it, the pressure in the air, the subtle distortion of reality. He looked around, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the tear, but it was hard to focus. His mind kept flickering, the memory of his last rift slipping through his thoughts like water through his fingers. They reached the center of the garage, and Zhang Wei's heart stopped. The rift was there, hovering in the air, a jagged tear in the space before him. It was massive this time, swirling with light and shadow, flashing images of the future, flashes of buildings he didn't recognize, faces he hadn't seen, moments he hadn't lived. They were all colliding together in a violent storm of time, tearing apart the present and the future in equal measure. Zhang Wei could hear voices now, distant and distorted, like whispers from another world. His head throbbed, and the air felt thin, like the world itself was holding its breath. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the device, his fingers trembling as he activated it. The device hummed, a low vibration that seemed to match the pulsing energy of the rift. He stepped forward, the weight of the task pressing on him, and as he approached the rift, he felt it again, the cold sensation, the fading of his memories. Faces from his past, his parents, old friends, the girl he had loved flashed before him, but they were blurry, distorted. He couldn't hold on to them. They were slipping away, and he knew that with each step he took, he was losing a piece of himself. He pressed the device to the rift, the warmth of it pushing against the cold tear in reality. The light exploded in a flash, blinding him for a moment. And then, everything stopped. The rift was gone, but Zhang Wei was no longer the same. His mind was clearer in some ways, but empty in others. The faces, the names, they were all fading. The person he had been was slipping away, just like the time he was trying to fix that. He looked over at Mingyu, and for a brief moment, he didn't recognize her. There was a pain in his chest, a sorrow he couldn't place, but it was fading fast, and he didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. Mingyu's expression was unreadable. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "You did it," she said quietly, but Zhang Wei didn't hear her. He couldn't. The memory of her, of everything, was already starting to fade. And in the silence of that moment, he understood. Time had claimed him, just as it claimed everything else. The rift was sealed, but Zhang Wei was lost.